Today we're going to take a brief look at modernization in the U.S. Southwest and El Paso from the 1880s to about 1920. In order to lay the groundwork for these changes beginning in the 1880s, let's go back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 and look at the changes that are happening in what became the U.S. Southwest after the treaty that ended the war created the new borderline. First of all, on the U.S. side, there was a tremendous loss of land, property transferred from Mexican ownership to Euro-American ownership. And this loss of land occurred through the legal system, through the taxation system, through provisions in the treaty itself, and also through violence. People were forced off their land at gunpoint. As people lose their land in the Southwest, they are pushed into looking for waged labor. Does this sound familiar from something I talked about in the Porfiriato? People lose their land and they are pushed into waged labor. So capitalism is coming into the Southwest that requires waged labor. There's a loss of political power. The Mexican elites who had been in power and then find themselves in the United States are then seen as second-class citizens because they are Mexican and lose their influence and social status as well. As half of Mexico is drawn into the United States, the Mexicans who are living on that land are seen as second-class citizens, are seen as not equal to Euro-Americans, and they fight to be considered white in order to maintain some kind of power. Just as in the Porfiriato, when the coming of the railroads helps to bring a different economic system, a different system of production, the coming of the railroads to the Southwest and to El Paso in the 1880s also changes everything. This is probably the third or the fourth lecture where I tell you that railroads change everything. And it's true. Railroads, remember, link El Paso and Juarez to each other and to the centers of the respective nations in the 1880s. And the people who are working on the railroads on the U.S. side are Chinese, they're Irish immigrants, and they're Mexican immigrants. The railroads allow goods and people to travel back and forth across the border freely. Just as in northern Mexico, one of the industries that's the economic driver of this development beginning in the 1880s is mining. Many of you remember the Asarco towers that were torn down a few years ago. Well, Asarco is a really good example of how economic development occurs in the Southwest that is tied to Mexican development, especially in the Mexican North. Asarco is the American Smelting Refining Company. And it begins in 1881. Its very first name is the Mexican Ore Company. It eventually becomes Asarco. It's bringing ore from Mexico through the railroads, being refined here and sold in the United States. And the labor force for Asarco is Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans who have lost their land. So mining ties the two countries together, often with Mexico providing the ore and the refining and the smelting happening on the U.S. side. If you look at photographs of El Paso from the 1880s and 90s, you're going to see a horizon filled with these smokestacks. So there were many, many refineries, very many smelting companies. Here's your discussion prompt for this week. In the class, you've learned about the Porfiriato and you've learned about modernization in the U.S. Southwest. In your 250-word discussion post, I want you to think about the commonalities and the differences you find on both sides of the border. For example, what was similar or what was different regarding the industries that developed, the composition of the labor force, and the role of the government in helping to stimulate development. So this is a compare and contrast discussion post. In addition to mining, agriculture is extremely important in the Southwest and in the El Paso region. You'll remember that back in the colonial period, there was quite a bit of agriculture, and I've mentioned several times the existence of many vineyards and the famous wine that came from this area. Well, we live in a desert, we know that. I've told you in another lecture that one of the things that hurt agriculture in this area was the drought, and also the fact that New Mexico farmers and ranchers were taking water from the Rio Grande before that water could reach El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. In the early 1900s, the U.S. federal government created the Land Reclamation Act. And the purpose of the Land Reclamation Act was to provide irrigation to the Southwest so that it could be agriculturally productive. You can see the great effect this had on California, for example. But it also influenced here. In 1911, as part of this Land Reclamation Act, they started construction on Elephant Butte Dam. I don't know if you've ever been by Elephant Butte Dam, which is by Caballo Lake, which is near Truth or Consequences. They started construction on the dam in 1911. It finally opens in 1916, and it's able to control the Rio Grande. So that's why often we see the Rio Grande without any water until early May, when the dam opens and the water comes down to this area. With the control of the water of the Rio Grande, with the creation of irrigation, this area becomes very prominent in cotton, particularly. The lower valley of El Paso becomes the prime cotton growing area. Up towards New Mexico, 40 miles from El Paso, you find chile, you find alfalfa, you find cotton as well. So this region is able to produce agriculturally because of the role of the federal government in the U.S. trying to stimulate agriculture. So who are the people that are working in agriculture, in mining, and in the railroads? For the great part, the labor force here in El Paso is comprised both of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. Mexican immigrants are working in the same kinds of jobs on both sides of the border: agriculture, railroads, and mining. One of the important things to know about Mexican labor here in the El Paso region, as well as the Southwest, is that there is a dual wage system in place. So for people doing the same jobs, if you are Euro-American, you get a higher wage. If you are Mexican, you get a lower wage. So wages are paid according to your nationality. You also have job wage discrepancies between men and women. In the railroads, you have Mexican wages, what are called white wages. You have Greek wages. You have Chinese wages. So the more diverse the labor force, the more levels of wages that you have. U.S. employers recruit Mexican workers to come to the U.S. to work. One, because they can pay them less, because there's this idea that they are here just temporarily and they will go back to Mexico. And many of them do want to go back to Mexico. There's also the idea that they are very easily controllable. And this is not true. We find strikes, for example, among workers. So, low wages, the idea that they're temporary and the idea that they're very controllable make Mexican workers very attractive to U.S. employers. When it comes to this idea of control, one of the ways that employers try to control Mexican workers is by encouraging them to bring their families. Because if a man has to support his family, he's going to be less willing to walk off the job. He's going to be less willing to go on strike. So the railroad industry invites men to work on the railroad, but to bring their families. And the families live in the boxcars as the men are traveling from workplace to workplace. And there's some settlements here on the U.S. side that started out as settlements made of used boxcars. So Rincon, New Mexico, which is near Hatch, New Mexico, was originally a boxcar settlement. There are babies born in the boxcars as the trains are traveling, and this makes it really hard for them to get documentation to prove their citizenship, for example. The other industry that really wants men to bring their families is agriculture. Men are paid so little working in the fields that in order to survive, everybody in the family has to work. The husband, the wife, and the kids are all working in the fields in order to pool their resources in order to survive. So there's all these kinds of strategies used by employers to control workers and to keep them at low wages.